5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to Highway of the Hidden, where the forgotten roads of history still breathe, and the night hides more than shadows. Here, the restless dead whisper in the dark, cryptids stalk the tree line, and conspiracies linger just out of sight. Every mile takes us deeper into the unknown, and every story carries a chill. So buckle up and join me as we take a ride down the highway.
There are some nights out on the edge of town where things don't feel wild in the normal way. Not coyotes, not stray dogs, not something you can brush off and say, yeah, that's just nature doing its thing. I'm talking about the kind of night where the animals go quiet before anything happens, where the dogs don't bark. They more or less whine, where the air feels still in a way that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like something is holding its breath. And then morning comes, and what you find doesn't exactly line up with anything you've ever been told about predators. No torn flesh scattered across the ground, no signs of a struggle, no tracks that make sense, just livestock, sort of laid out, clean in a way that shouldn't be possible, and somewhere on the body, small punctures. Sometimes one, sometimes two, and sometimes even three, placed in a way that feels almost deliberate. And the story that always follows sounds the same in tone, even when the details change. It wasn't eaten, it wasn't torn apart, it looked drained. And that's where the name comes from. Chupacabra. Chupacabra. Literally, goat sucker. And I know how that sounds at first. It sounds like folklore. It sounds like something exaggerated, stretched over time, maybe misunderstood. But here's where it gets strange. Because when you start digging into it, and I mean really digging into it, the story doesn't stay in one place. It doesn't stay in one form. It doesn't even stay the same creature. Depending on where you are, what people describe changes completely. In one place, it's something out of a nightmare, reptilian, spined, upright, almost alien. In another, it's something closer to the ground, hairless, twisted, canine thing with skin pulled tight over bone. Same name, same fear, completely different bodies. And yet, the attacks people talk about, the feeling they describe before and after, that part stays eerily consistent. So tonight, you're going to understand why this thing refuses to sit still in just one shape, because whatever the chupacabra is, it doesn't behave like one creature. If you trace this story back to where it really starts to take shape, you land right in Puerto Rico, mid-1990s. But before that, there's something sitting just underneath it. Something quieter that most people don't talk about unless they've really looked into it. Back in 1975, in a small town called Moca, farmers started finding animals dead under strange circumstances. They called it the El Vampiro del Moca. I hope I didn't butcher that. Literally, the vampire of Moca. Even back then, the word vampire wasn't being used casually. It wasn't just drama. It was the only word they had for what they were seeing. Animals weren't being torn apart. They weren't half eaten. They were being found with marks, and something about them looked off, like something had been taken without the usual mess that comes with a predator. At the time, people tried to explain it away. Some said it was cult activities, others said it was just dogs, something they didn't fully understand yet. And for a while, it just faded until 1995. That's when everything changes. Because in March of that year, 8 sheep were found dead, and this time, the description is sharper, more specific, harder to ignore. Each one has puncture wounds, 3 of them clustered in the chest, not scattered, not random, but placed. And again, people were starting to say the same thing, that they had looked drained. Now, here's where it starts to lock into something more real for the people living there, because a few months later in August, a woman named Madeline Tolentino reports seeing something. Not just hearing about it, not just finding the aftermath, seeing it in a town called Canovanas. She describes something that does not sound like anything local wildlife could explain. About 3 to 4 foot tall, standing, not on all fours, but upright. Leathery skin, grayish, maybe greenish, depending on the light. The eyes were large, dark, deep set in a way that made them feel too aware. And the detail that gets repeated over and over again after this, a row of spines running from the back of the neck all the way down to the base of the tail. Not first standing up, not bristles, spines, quills, something rigid, something structured. And the way it moved, that's what people couldn't shake. It didn't run like a dog. It didn't stalk like a cat. It hopped. Not constantly, but when it moved fast, it had this strange, almost kangaroo-like motion, powerful hind legs, shorter front limbs, bursts of movement instead of a steady gait. That image spreads fast. And then the attacks increase. Not one farm, not two, hundreds of reports across Puerto Rico. We're talking goats, chickens, dogs, livestock of all kinds. Some farmers reporting dozens of animals lost. And when they described the scene, it didn't feel chaotic, it felt controlled. Animals found close together, no wide scattering, no dragging across land, just dropped. And those punctures again, small, circular, sometimes one, sometimes two, but often three, forming almost a downward triangle. That detail right there, people remember that because it doesn't feel like an accident, it feels deliberate. Now, here's where we slow down for a second because there are explanations that get brought into this story later. There are scientists, investigators, people who come in and try to line this up with known behavior. And they'll say things like, well, animals aren't actually drained of blood. That's not physically happening the way people think. They'll talk about internal bleeding, shock, the way carcasses can look after death. And sure, that is part of the conversation. But when you listen to the people who were there, that's not what stayed with them. What stayed with them was the feeling that something wasn't feeding the way predators feed. It was taking something without acting like it needed the rest. And that's what gives us this first version of the Chupacabra shape, not just physically, but behaviorally. Because in Puerto Rico, in those early reports, this thing doesn't feel like a sick animal. It doesn't feel like something struggling. It feels intentional. It shows up, takes what it wants, and it's out of there. So here's where it starts to spread, because within a year, you're not just hearing about this in Puerto Rico, you're hearing about this all across Latin America, Mexico, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Nicaragua. Different countries, same name, Chupacabra. But here's where it gets interesting, because the description doesn't always stay the exact same, but it does stay close enough that you can recognize it. In parts of Chile, around the early 2000s, there are reports of livestock being found in similar conditions. Farmers describing animals that looked like something had attacked them, but not in the way dogs or foxes would. And again, there are investigations. There are conclusions drawn later that dogs, local predators, and things like that didn't make sense. But during the time it's happening, the stories all carry the same tone. Something strange, something not behaving the way it should. And when you move into Argentina, early 2000s again, you're starting to get cattle mutilations, strange removals, stories getting tied into the same phenomenon. Some of it gets explained later, and it could have been foxes, rodents, scavengers doing what they do, but the label always sticks, Chupacabra. Because by this point, the name isn't just tied to one exact creature anymore, it's tied to a type of encounter. Something attacks, something leaves behind something that doesn't feel right, and people reach for the same word. Now, here's the shift, because as this thing moves north into Mexico, into the southern United States, the body starts to change. And this is where a lot of people get confused if they're trying to pin it down as one single animal. Because the Puerto Rico version, that reptilian upright spine creature, that starts fading, and what replaces it is something a lot closer to the ground. Something people start describing as dog-like, but not normal, hairless or nearly hairless. The skin's looking grayish blue, thickened, sometimes wrinkled, sometimes stretched tight like it doesn't quite fit the body underneath. A pronounced spine ridge running along the back, long snout, sharp teeth, eyes that seem sunken in, front legs shorter than the back, giving it this uneven posture when it moves, and the smell. That's something people don't forget. A strong, almost rotting odor. Not like a clean predator, not like something healthy, but something off, something wrong. So these reports do start showing up heavily in northern Mexico and Texas. And this is where we start getting actual physical bodies. Creatures that people catch, kill, or find already dead, and they look strange enough to keep the story alive. And in 2004, near San Antonio, Texas, a rancher kills something attacking his livestock. What he describes and what people see when they look at it doesn't look like a healthy coyote. It looks like something twisted. It's hairless, skin discolored, proportions a little off. They call it the Elmendorf beast. And for a moment, people wonder if this is a thing that's been moving through the stories. But then DNA testing comes back. It's coyote, severely manged, and that explanation starts repeating over and over. More carcasses are showing up in Texas, same look, same strange appearance, and every time scientists get their hands on it, they obviously say it's a coyote, it's a dog, or a hybrid, and it has mange, the same stuff. And that it's suffering from sarcoptic mange, a parasite that causes hair loss, skin thickening, and the general breakdown of the animal's presence. But here's the part that actually matters in how the story keeps going, because those explanations don't erase the sightings. They explain the body, but they don't fully replace what people felt when they saw it. Because if you're standing there at night, okay, and something comes out of the dark, hairless, skin gray, eyes sunken, moving wrong, smelling like decay, you're not thinking, that's a coyote with mange. You're thinking, what the hell is that? And when you already have a name in circulations, that's what you use, Chupacabra. And that's how the second version takes hold, not as something reptilian, not as something upright and spined, but as something familiar, turned into something wrong. Something that looks like it belongs here, but doesn't feel like it should, which is very strange because now we have two versions of the same creature living at the same time in different places with different bodies, and somehow they're still tied to the same name. Here's where it starts to feel less like one single cryptid creature doing this and more like something that's moving through people's understanding or perspective of it. Because once that dog-like version takes hold in northern Mexico and the southern United States, the encounters don't slow down, they just start to change. And the way people experience them starts to get more personal, less we found something in the field and more of I saw it. You start hearing about ranchers who don't just wake up to dead livestock, they hear something the night before, and it's not loud, it's not chaotic, just enough to get their attention and pull them outside. And when they step out into that dark, because out there, it's not city dark, it's real dark. They catch movement near the edge of the fence line or just past where the light reaches. And what they describe doesn't come out clean. It never does because it's moving just enough that you can't lock onto it fully, but you'll get pieces like the back arched in a way that doesn't look natural, the legs uneven, almost like it's built for short bursts instead of distance, the head low, then lifting just enough that the eyes catch light. And those eyes don't shine like a normal animal, not that clean reflection you expect. People describe them as dull or too deep, like the light doesn't come back the way it should, and then it's gone. No dramatic chase, no sound tearing through the night, just there, and then it's not. And when the morning hits, that's when you get the confirmation that something was there. Chickens dead inside coops that weren't broken open, goats found near fencing like they never tried to run, dogs that should have barked, found silent, and again, that same strange restraint, not ripped apart, not dragged, just taken down. Now, in places like Texas, this becomes almost routine for a while. Not routine in the sense that people get comfortable with it, but routine in the sense that the reports keep coming. Out in Cuero, Texas, that's one of the spots that gets a lot of attention because in 2007, a woman named Phyllis Cannon starts noticing something over time. It's not one night, it's not one incident, it's weeks. She's losing chickens, but not all at once, but consistently enough that she knows something is targeting her property. And she starts watching, waiting, trying to catch it on camera, and eventually something turns up, not alive, dead, but intact enough to study. And when people see the photos, it hits that same nerve again. The hairless body, the grayish blue skin, long snout, teeth exposed more than they should be, the spine visible under the skin like it's pressing outward, and the proportions just slightly off from what you'd expect from a healthy animal. She has it preserved. She keeps it because to her, this is a thing she has been dealing with. Now, here comes the experts again, right? They want DNA testing, analysis, and once more, they give us the same old song and dance that it's coyotes. But not just a normal one, a hybrid mixed with Mexican wolf, affected by mange. And that explanation should settle it, and it should close this case, but it doesn't. Because people don't just remember what it was, they remember what it looked like. And more importantly, what it felt like to be around it. And that's the part that doesn't go away. Now, here's another moment in Texas that sticks with people for a different reason. A deputy sheriff, Brandon Rydell, captures something on dash cam footage. Not a clear, perfect shot, but just enough. The animal is moving through an alley, hairless, long snout, short front legs, longer back legs. The body almost dips forward when it walks, and it's not sprinting, it's just moving like it belongs there. Like it's not worried about being seen. And even from that grainy footage, something about it doesn't sit right. It's too calm, too comfortable. And again, the explanation comes in. Likely a coyote, likely mange. And logically, that lines up. But that we know that's not true. And you truly have a belief in cryptids, then you know that's not true. Imagine sitting in a patrol car, watching that thing cross through your headlights in the middle of the night. You're not thinking about parasites. You're thinking, that's not supposed to look like that. And that reaction is what keeps feeding this thing. Now, here's where it stretches even further because it doesn't stay locked in Texas. You start getting reports way outside the expected range. Okay. They had one as far as Maine in 2006. A woman photographed something on the side of the road, already dead, hit by a car. But even then, it's hard to identify. The body looks like a mix between a dog and something else entirely. Thin, hairless in patches, features pulled in a way that doesn't feel stable. Her husband describes it as part rodent, part canine. And eventually, they get DNA from it. And what do they say it is? A wolf-dog hybrid. Again, something easily explainable, something to keep the people calm, just like the same thing they do with the Bigfoot sightings or the Dogman sightings. You're seeing things, you're imagining it. But we know that they're out there. This is not something you'd expect to just casually find like that, and definitely not something you'd expect to be tied into the same name being used thousands of miles away, okay? Chupacabra. Now, think about how far that is from Puerto Rico, from that original description, from the upright, spined reptilian figure. At this point, if you're still trying to hold on to the idea that this is one single animal species, it starts slipping because now you have two completely different physical forms, both being called the same thing, both tied to livestock attacks, both tied to that same uneasy feeling people describe when they encounter it. And neither one sits cleanly in one box. Now let's go back for a second to the behavior, because regardless of which version people are seeing, the way the attacks are described keeps circling the same ideas. The animals are not being consumed the way you'd expect. Kills that feel excessive for what's taken. Sometimes animals left behind entirely, and that's where people start trying to figure out what this thing is. Not just what it looks like, but what it's doing. Some lean toward the idea that it's a predator under stress, something sick, something that can't hunt normally anymore, so it goes after easier targets, livestock, chicken, animals that can't fight back as well, those type of things. And that would line up with the mange, with the weakness, with desperation. But then there are the accounts out there where that doesn't quite fit, where the animal, whatever it is, doesn't look weak. It looks controlled, quick, efficient, and it's in and out. And those are the moments that keep the older versions alive in people's minds. Because even if they are looking at something that resembles a dog, and that gap, that's the difference between what people see and what they feel they experience. That's where the legend keeps breathing. Now, there's one more thing that starts showing up as this spreads: mistaken identity. Because once a name gets out there and once people know what Chupacabra is supposed to be, anything that even slightly resembles it starts getting pulled into that category, right? A hairless dog, stray animals with disease, even things like the Mexican hairless dog, completely natural, completely known. But if you catch one at night under the wrong lighting, moving in a way you're not used to seeing, your brain fills in the rest. And that doesn't make people wrong. It just shows them how powerful the image has become, because by now, the Chupacabra isn't just one creature, it's a lens. It's the name people reach for when something crosses into a space between I recognize that and I don't understand what I just saw. And that space, that's where things get dangerous to ignore, because it means that the story isn't just about one animal anymore. It's about the way something unfamiliar moves through different environments and gets reshaped each time it does. The longer you sit with this, the harder it gets to pretend it's just one thing wearing different faces. Because by the time these encounters spread across Puerto Rico, Mexico, Texas, and even further out, you're not just dealing with sightings anymore. You're dealing with interpretations. People trying to explain what they're seeing in real time using whatever frame of reality they have. And that's where the Chupacabra stops being just a creature and starts becoming something people are trying to define. Now, if you go back to Puerto Rico, to that original wave in 1995, and you really sit with those descriptions, not just the physical features, but the way people talk about the encounter itself, it doesn't feel like an animal sighting in the traditional sense. It feels like something that wasn't supposed to be there. Not rare, not elusive. Out of place, kinda. That reptilian body, the spines, the upright posture, the way it moved and burst instead of steady rhythm, it doesn't line up cleanly with anything native to the island. And people notice that immediately, which is why some of the earliest beliefs around it didn't land on an unknown animal. They landed on something else entirely, something created, something brought in, something that didn't originate there at all. And that idea spreads fast, especially when you have reports of hundreds of animals being killed in a short period of time. Because people start asking, if this thing wasn't here before, where did it come from? And you'll hear answers that range wide depending on who you talk to. Some people lean into the idea of experimentation, something biological that got lost, something altered. Others go further, something that crossed over, whether you want to call that extraterrestrial, interdimensional, whatever word fits your belief system. And I'm not throwing those words out there to sound dramatic. I'm telling you that because that's where people's minds go when what they're seeing doesn't line up with anything familiar. Because that original Puerto Rican version, it doesn't feel sick. It doesn't feel like something breaking down. It feels intact, purposeful, like it knows exactly what it's doing. And then you fast forward and you move north, Mexico, Texas, the body changes. And now you're looking at something that could be explained as an animal, something that could be broken down into known biology, coyotes, dogs, hybrids. But here's the part that doesn't sit clean. Because if this is just disease, if this is just mange, if this is just animals struggling to survive, then why does the behavior still carry that same edge? Why do people still describe something feels off beyond just appearance? Because you would expect desperation, you would expect messy kills, you would expect chaos. But that's not always what people report. Sometimes it's quick, sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's like something comes in, does exactly what it came to do, and leaves before anything has time to react. And that's where those two versions start overlapping in a way that doesn't make sense if you try to keep them separate. Because if you have one version that looks like an alien acting controlled and another version that looks like a broken animal, so people start trying to connect the dots, not in a scientific way, but in a lived experience way. And one of the ideas that come up again and again, especially in areas where both types of sightings have been talked about, is that maybe it's not about the body at all. Maybe the body is just what you're seeing in that moment. And whatever this thing is moves through different forms depending on where it is or how it's being perceived. Now, I know that sounds like a jump, but think about how often people describe the feeling first and the details second. That sense before something is wrong, before they even get a clear look at it, that heaviness in the air, that hesitation before stepping outside, right? That silence from animals that should be reacting. That part shows up in Puerto Rico. It shows up in Mexico. It shows up in places where the physical description doesn't even match anymore. And when something carries the same presence but changes its appearance, people start asking a different kind of question. Not what kind of animal this is, but what am I actually dealing with? Because now it's not just about biology, it's about intent. And that word, that's where things get serious, because intent implies awareness. It implies choice. It implies something that isn't just reacting to hunger or survival. And you can hear that in the way some of these encounters are told. Farmers who say the same animal came back, not randomly, but to the same property. People who feel like they were being watched before anything happened. Witnesses described eye contact that lasts just a little too long, like something recognizing them. Now, you can push back on me if you want, and you can say that's the fear talking, that's adrenaline, that's the mind trying to fill in the gaps. And sometimes, yeah, that's part of it, but not all of it. Because when different people who live in different places, who don't know each other, who aren't trying to tell the same story, start describing the same kind of awareness, you don't ignore that. You sit with it. Kind of like people have been seeing Bigfoot for thousands of years. And that brings us to something else that starts getting talked about as this spreads through Mexico and the southern US. The idea that this thing, whatever it is, isn't just physical, that it operates on the edge of being seen, not invisible, not gone, but just hard to lock onto. People will describe watching it move and then losing it, even when there's nowhere obvious for it to go, or hearing something close and not being able to place it, or feeling like something is there, and then when they turn to look, it's already moved. Not in a fast, normal sense, but ahead of where it should be. And that's where the conversation shifts again, because now you're not just dealing with two physical descriptions, you're dealing with the idea that the form itself might not be fixed. Whether you believe that or not, that idea doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from people trying to make sense of something that doesn't behave consistently. Now, here's something else that gets pulled into this, especially when you start looking at how quickly the legend spread in the mid-90s. The media. Stories moving fast, descriptions being shared, repeated, reshaped, because there's even talk that the original description in Puerto Rico might have been influenced by something seen on screen, something that looked familiar. But here's the thing, even if that's true, even if the image was influenced, that doesn't explain the encounters themselves. They were reacting to something they experienced, and those experiences didn't stop when the story spread. They kept going across different environments, across different types of terrain, across different kinds of people who had no reason to make it up. And that's what keeps this from being written off so easily, because it doesn't behave like a single misunderstanding. It behaves like something that keeps adapting or being interrupted differently depending on where it shows up. And the deeper you go into it, the less it feels like you're chasing a creature, and the more it feels like you're circling something you can't fully pin down, something that leaves evidence but never enough to settle it, something that shows itself but never long enough to be clearly understood. And whatever this is, it's still out there, moving through places where lines between known and unknown gets thin, and people are still running into it. When you get close to something like this, that's when the tone changes. Because it's one thing to hear about dead livestock, it's one thing to see pictures, to talk about what it might be, but it's something completely different when you realize how close people have actually been to it. Not miles away, not somewhere out there, right outside, just across your fence line, the edge of your yard, close enough that it wanted to close the distance, it could. And that's the part people don't always say out loud, but you can hear it sitting underneath the way they tell it. That moment where curiosity turns into something heavier, because when people see it up close, whether it's that older upright version or the lower dog-like one, there's a point where it stops feeling like an animal encounter and starts feeling like you're being noticed. Not in a passing way, not in that quick natural glance predators give before moving on, but in a way that lingers just a little too long, like something trying to understand you the same way you're trying to understand it. And that's where most people stop moving. And that's where instinct kicks in, because something in you recognizes this isn't normal. Now, there are stories, quiet ones, not usually told for attention, where people didn't just see it and go back inside. They stayed out for a second too long. They watched a little closer than they should have. And that's when the distance starts to matter, because when this thing moves, it doesn't always build up to it. There's no warning run, no drawn out approach. It's still, and then it's not. And we're talking a shift, a burst, and suddenly it's somewhere else. It's closer. And even if it doesn't fully commit, even if it doesn't come all the way in, that moment sticks with you, because you realize how fast that gap could disappear if it chose to. Now think about the environment. Most of these happen in rural areas, open land, places where once the sun drops, you don't have streetlights. You don't have neighbors right next door. You've got darkness and whatever shares it with you. And if something like this is moving through that space, it owns it in a way you don't. That's why so many of these encounters end the same way. People back up slowly, not turning their back, not running, just easing away and getting away from getting to a door, getting to light. And once that barrier is there, once they're inside, that's when the adrenaline hits. That's when it finally catches up to them to how close they just were to this creature. Because up until that point, it doesn't always feel loud. It feels controlled, right? Quiet. Like something doesn't need to rush because it already understands the space it's in. Now, here's where we get a little heavier because while most encounters end with distance and separation, not all of them feel like they were meant to. There are accounts scattered but consistent in tone where whatever this is didn't just pass through, it lingered and then it came back. Not necessarily attacking people directly, but not avoiding them either. And that's a different kind of presence because most predators, once they realize a human is aware, they skedaddle, they get out of there, they don't hang around. But when something doesn't immediately pull back, when it stays within that range, that's when people start feeling like they're not just sharing space with it, they're being tested, not attacked, not chased, but watched, measured. And that idea, that feeling, carries into what people do after. Because once something like that happens, you don't just go back to normal. You don't walk outside at night the same way. You don't ignore the sounds the same way. Every moment at the edge of your property, every animal acting just a little off starts to hit different because now you've seen something that doesn't fit cleanly into anything you were taught to expect. Now, let's bring this back to what we've built across the whole thing because we've got two bodies, two different very forms, one upright, spined, almost unnatural in design, the other low, canine, but twisted, altered. Something that looks like it's been through something and came out the other side wrong. And we've got the behavior that overlaps just enough to keep tying them together. Quiet movement, focused attacks, presence before action, disappearance before explanation, and a reaction from people that goes beyond, that was a strange animal. It lingers. So what do you think we're actually looking at? Because if you try to force it into one box, the box will break apart. If you say it's just a diseased animal, that explains the bodies found in Texas, Mexico, places where we've had physical evidence, but it doesn't fully reach back to Puerto Rico and it doesn't fully explain that first wave, that first shape. If you say something non-native, something brought in, something created, that holds weight in those early descriptions. But then you have to account for why what's being found later looks so grounded in known biology. And if you step back and you don't rush in to answer it, what you're left with is something that doesn't settle, something that shows up differently depending on where it is, but carries the same effect on the people who encounter it. Maybe that's the part that matters most, not locking them into one form, not forcing a final answer, but recognizing that whatever this is, it's consistent in one way that's hard to ignore. It enters a space quietly, it leaves evidence that something happened, but never enough to fully explain it, and it stays just outside the line of being understood, close enough to be seen, never long enough to be defined. And that's where we'll leave it. Because whether you believe this is one creature, multiple, something natural, or something that isn't, people are still finding animals the same way. People are still seeing shapes in the dark that don't move the way they should. And people are still stepping outside at night, feeling that same stillness in the air and wondering if they're alone or if something is already out there watching from just beyond the lights in. Thank you for listening tonight, everyone. I'm your host, Polar Bear. This has been Highway of the Hidden. If you've had an encounter with the Chupacabra or something unnatural and you want to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is polarbearhoth@gmail.com, or you can reach out to me on TikTok and Instagram, polarbearhoth, or Facebook, Highway of the Hidden. Thank you for listening. And remember, folks, keep your lights bright on the highway because you never know what's outside your field of view.
And as the road disappears into the mist, the hidden waits for those brave enough to follow. Until next time, keep your eyes on the shadows and remember, every highway has its secrets. This has been Highway of the Hidden.